You're standing in the appliance section of a big box store looking at a washing machine. The price tag says $878. You remember, not precisely, but in that way, your body remembers that this same category of machine cost somewhere around $750 a few years ago. You figure inflation, you figure supply chain, you figure maybe they added some feature you didn't ask for, a steam cycle, or a Wi-Fi connection to an app you'll never download. What you do not figure, because nothing on the tag tells you, is that roughly $86 of that price is a tax. Not sales tax. That gets added at the register where you can see it. This tax was collected at a shipping port months before the machine reached the store. It was paid by an American importer, folded into the wholesale price, marked up through the distribution chain, and handed to you embedded in the sticker. There is no line item. There is no disclosure. There is no opt-out. It's called a tariff. And according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, tariffs cost American consumers and businesses $51 billion in a single year. Divide that across roughly 131 million households, and you get about $389 per family. And that is just the direct duty cost. It doesn't include the markup compounding, the deadweight loss, or the price increases on domestic goods that rose under the tariff umbrella. When independent economic analyses account for those effects, the estimates range from $800 to $2,600 per household per year, depending on which tariffs are measured and the modeling approach used. The mid-range figure, the one multiple credible analyses converge on for the tariff regime through 2019, lands around $1,200. Under expanded tariffs, taking effect in 2025, the Yale Budget Lab estimates the number could climb to $2,100 to $3,800. Those are not small numbers, and you have never seen a receipt for any of it. Here is what I want to do. I want to trace exactly how a tariff moves from a policy announcement to the price you pay at a store. I want to walk through 5 specific products and show you the documented cost on each one. And I want to show you who bears the heaviest share of this cost, because the answer to that question is the part that should genuinely bother you. Let's start with the mechanics, because the mechanics are where the first myth lives. You have probably heard the phrase that tariffs make foreign countries pay, that the exporting nation absorbs the cost, that a 25% tariff on Chinese goods means China is sending us money. This is not an ambiguous question in economics. A tariff is a tax assessed at the U.S. border, and the legal liability falls on the importer of record, a U.S.-based company that files customs paperwork with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Not a foreign government, not a foreign factory. An American company writing an American check. In 2019, economists Mary Amiti, Stephen Redding, and David Weinstein published a study in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, measuring who actually paid the 2018 tariffs on Chinese goods. Their finding was blunt. The full incidence of the tariffs fell on domestic consumers and importers, with no significant change in the foreign export prices. Chinese producers did not lower their prices by a single cent to absorb the tariff. The entire cost landed on the U.S. side of the transaction. A subsequent study by Feigelbaum, Goldberg, Kennedy, and Condelwall, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, confirmed it with additional data. This is not a fringe finding. This is the consensus of peer-reviewed trade economics. So let me walk you through the chain. A U.S. importer buys goods from a foreign manufacturer at an agreed price. When those goods arrive at a U.S. port, Customs assesses the tariff based on the product classification. The importer pays the duty before the goods are released. Now the importer's cost is purchase price plus shipping, plus insurance, plus the tariff. That total becomes the new wholesale price to the distributor. The distributor adds a margin. The retailer adds a margin. And here is where the math gets quietly vicious. Because the tariff is embedded in the base cost, every percentage-based markup downstream compounds on top of it. A 25% tariff on a $100 wholesale item adds $25 at the border. But with typical retail markup of 50 to 100%, the shelf price increase is $37 to $50. You pay the compounded number. And no one tells you. Now let's trace 5 products. I want you to feel these in your actual life. Product 1. The washing machine. In January 2018, safeguard tariffs hit imported large residential washing machines, 20% on the first 1.2 million units, 50% above that threshold. Economists at the University of Chicago and the Federal Reserve studied what happened next. Washing machine prices rose approximately $86 to $92 per unit within months. But here is the part that should stop you cold. Dryer prices rose by almost the same amount. Dryers were not tariffed. Not a single percentage point of duty applied to dryers. Manufacturers used the tariff as cover to raise prices across entire product lines. Researchers calculated that American consumers paid roughly $1.5 billion more per year for washers and dryers combined, and the tariff created approximately 1,800 manufacturing jobs. Divide those numbers. Each job cost consumers about $815,000 per year. The median salary for those jobs is around $55,000. Let that ratio sit for a second. Product 2. Canned food. Section 232 tariffs imposed a 10% duty on aluminum imports in March 2018, later raised to 25%. Aluminum can sheet prices rose 8 to 15% in the following year. The per-can impact seems trivial, 2 to 6 cents, but Americans consume roughly 100 billion aluminum cans per year. The per-household annual cost of aluminum tariffs across canned goods, beverages, and aluminum foil adds up to an estimated $25 to $60 per year. You don't notice it on any single can of beans. You notice it when your grocery bill is somehow $40 higher this month and you cannot figure out where it went. Product 3. Clothing. And this is where it starts to feel like the system is working backward. Clothing already carried significant tariffs before 2018. The average U.S. tariff on clothing imports was approximately 12%, among the highest of any consumer goods category. Section 301 tariffs added 7.5 to 25% on top of that for Chinese-origin textiles. But here is the structural detail that matters. The cheapest clothing faces the highest tariff rates. Synthetic fiber clothing, the kind sold at discount retailers, the kind purchased disproportionately by lower-income families, carries tariffs up to 32%. Luxury wool, 16%. The tariff schedule is inverted relative to ability to pay. The less you can afford to spend on clothing, the higher the percentage of tax you're paying. The American Apparel and Footwear Association estimated that combined clothing tariffs represented roughly $77 billion in costs passed to U.S. consumers annually. Product 4. Consumer electronics. Smartphones were initially excluded from tariffs because of how immediately visible the price increase would be, which tells you something about what the architects of the policy understood about consumer awareness. When a 15% tariff on smartphones and laptops was briefly imposed in September 2019, analysts estimated a per-device cost increase of $60 to $120 on a typical smartphone. The Congressional Budget Office noted that consumer electronics retail runs on thin margins, typically 5 to 15%, meaning there is almost no capacity to absorb tariff costs. They pass straight through. Product 5. Grocery staples. Imported cheese faces, tariffs up to 25% depending on type. Olive oil carries duties of 3.4 to 5 cents per kilogram. Certain coffee preparations face tariffs up to 10%. The USDA Economic Research Service notes that food price pass-through from tariffs is slower than for durable goods, typically 6 to 12 months, because food supply chains involve more intermediaries and long-term contracts buffer short-term cost changes. The tariff hits. You just don't feel it for half a year, and by the time it reaches your grocery receipt, it is indistinguishable from every other price increase you've been absorbing. That is the mechanism. 5 products, documented costs on each, and every single one invisible at the point of sale. Now I want to show you who pays the most, because this is where the math turns from frustrating to something harder to sit with. The Tax Foundation, a nonpartisan tax policy research organization, has documented that tariffs function as a regressive consumption tax. Lower-income households pay a higher effective tariff rate than higher-income households. The reason is structural. Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that households in the lowest income quintile spend approximately 82% of their after-tax income on goods and services. The highest quintile spends about 64%. Since tariffs only affect goods, not services like rent or healthcare, and since lower-income households buy proportionally more tariff-affected goods like cheap clothing, basic electronics, and canned food, the burden falls disproportionately on those who can absorb it least. Research by Furman, Russ, and Shambaugh found that the lowest income quintile of U.S. households pays an effective tariff rate approximately 1.5 times higher than the highest income quintile. Think about that for a second. You have a tax that is invisible, that appears on no receipt, that the person paying it cannot identify at the moment of purchase, and that falls hardest on the people with the least room in their budget. You cannot design a more regressive tax if you tried. Actually, the 32% tariff on cheap synthetic clothing versus 16% on luxury wool suggests someone did design it this way, or at minimum, nobody redesigned it to fix it. If you're watching this and thinking about where these costs land in your own household, I'd be curious what you've noticed. Comment with what's been rising in your budget that you couldn't quite explain. I suspect a lot of you have felt this without having the numbers to name it. Now, the justification you hear most often for tariffs is job protection. And this is an area where honest presentation matters because the answer is not zero. The U.S. International Trade Commission estimated that steel and aluminum tariffs preserved approximately 3,200 jobs in steel production and created roughly 700 new steelworking positions in the 18 months following implementation. Those are real jobs held by real people with real families. That is not nothing, but the same report noted that downstream industries, manufacturers who use steel as an input, companies making auto parts, machinery, construction materials, shed approximately 75,000 jobs due to increased input costs over a similar period. A Federal Reserve Board study by Flahan and Pierce found that while tariff-protected sectors saw modest employment gains, the broader manufacturing sector experienced a net negative employment effect because retaliatory tariffs and higher input costs offset the gains. The Peterson Institute calculated that each steelworking job preserved by steel tariffs cost consumers roughly $900,000 per year in higher prices. The median steelworker salary is approximately $55,000. You can make a case that preserving domestic capacity in strategic industries is worth a cost. That is a legitimate position held by serious economists, including Dani Rodrik at Harvard, who argues that tariffs can serve industrial policy goals even when they impose short-term consumer costs. But what you cannot reasonably make a case for is that consumers should bear that cost without knowing they're bearing it, without seeing the line item, without being able to weigh the trade-off. And that brings us to the transparency gap, which is the part of this that should bother everyone, regardless of where they stand on trade policy. You can see your income tax. It is on your paycheck every 2 weeks, itemized. You can see your sales tax. It is on your receipt, separated from the purchase price. You can see your property tax. It arrives annually with a specific dollar amount and a due date. You can even see your Social Security contribution. It is right there on your pay stub. The tariff is the tax you never see. There is no legal requirement for retailers to disclose the tariff component of a product's price. By the time the product reaches a shelf, the tariff has been absorbed into the wholesale cost and is indistinguishable from shipping costs, manufacturer margin, or any other component. You cannot calculate it at the point of purchase. You cannot comparison shop around it. You cannot even confirm it exists by looking at the thing you just bought. Every other tax in your life has a receipt. This one doesn't. And the aggregation is what makes it matter. 2 cents on a can of beans, $60 on a phone, $86 on a washing machine, $50 on a dryer that wasn't even tariffed, a few dollars on every bag of groceries for 6 months after a new duty takes effect. None of them large enough to notice individually. All of them adding up to somewhere between $800 and $2,600 a year, depending on which tariffs are in force and which economist is running the model. Under the expanded 2025 tariff regime, the Yale Budget Lab puts it at $2,100 to $3,800. You cannot budget your way out of a cost you cannot see. Here is what I am not going to tell you. I am not going to tell you tariffs are good or bad. I am not going to tell you which trade policy to support. I am not going to name an administration or a party, because the mechanism works the same regardless of who enacted it. Tariffs have been part of U.S. trade policy since the literal second law passed by the first Congress in 1789. They predate income tax by 124 years. The question was never whether they exist. The question is whether the people paying them know they're paying them, and whether they have any way to evaluate whether the cost is worth what it buys. The answer, right now, is no. You don't know the amount. You can't see the line item. You can't evaluate the trade-off. And the cost is structured so that the less money you make, the higher the percentage of your income it takes. That is not a political statement. That is the documented structure of the tariff schedule, cross-referenced with Bureau of Labor Statistics consumer expenditure data. Next time you're standing in a store, the appliance aisle, the grocery section, the clothing rack, the electronics counter, look at the price tag. Everything you need to know about the product is on that tag except one thing: the tax you already paid before you ever picked it up. It is built into the number. It has no name on the receipt. And whether that cost is buying you something worth having is a question that nobody in the supply chain is paid to help you answer. Knowing the question exists is the first thing. The numbers to frame it are the second. You now have both. Subscribe if you want the math done honestly. I won't sell you anything.